As with the Battle of the Medway, the mantle of leadership in the Battle of Hastings was lifted from the majority inhabitants to the minority invaders. This time, instead of Romans, it was to the Normans. The events leading up to the battle started with the Saxon King Edward the Confessor. His reign, which started in 1042, had been 22 years, and soon he would be dead. And upon that death, multiple claimants to the succession would stake theirs on the throne of England. Edward did himself no favors by having no direct heirs in the form of children, and in the murky, muddled way he handled the question of succession. First up, we have Edward the Exile, otherwise known as Edward Atheling. Edward had spent most of his life in the Kingdom of Hungary following his father's defeat by Canute the Great. King Edward had named him a successor in 1056, but he died shortly after returning to England in 1057. His son Edgar would be elected after the king's death, but he would never become king. Tostig Godwinson is next. He was related to the king, but exiled by him. Tostig would accompany King Harald Hardrada in his planned invasion of England, but both would die in the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Then we have William, the would-be conqueror. His claim on the English throne, a supposed promise from the dead king in life. William, a descendant of the Viking warlord Rollo, had adopted a French dialect, but was still every bit the Viking Rollo was. Lastly, we have Harold Godwinson. It's unclear if Edward selected him on his deathbed. However, what is clear is that the Witan assembly, which convened the day after Edward's death, did select him as king, and he was crowned as such. In September of the year 1066, a large fleet of Viking warships, led by King Hardrada of Norway, approached northern England. With him, one of King Harold's brothers, the exiled Tostig Godwinson, who had pledged his aid and his brother's throne to Hardrada, a throne that wasn't his to give. Their force of 10,000 is soon met by a small army of 5,000 local English northerners whom they defeat in the Battle of Fulford on the 20th of September. Meanwhile, in the south, King Harold had been awaiting William's invasion fleet, going as far as disbanding the army after weeks of no sign from William. He then receives word of Hardrada's landing to the north and his resulting capture of York. Harold force marches his army towards York, covering the roughly 190 miles in just 4 days. It is rumored that before the battle, Harold offered his brother the return of his earldom if he would but turn on Hardrada. When Tostig asked him what Harold would give Hardrada in return, Harold replied, 7 feet of English ground, as he is taller than other men. William, meanwhile, prepared to cross the Channel for the second time on the 27th of September, having been unsuccessful earlier in the month due to storms, arriving as Harold battled Hardrada in a hard-fought victory in the north. He was in the midst of celebrating at a banquet in York when he received word that William was in the south at Hastings. What came next were a series of decisions that Harold made that historians have debated ever since. The first, an offer by his brother Geirth to head south and lead the army against William himself. Geirth told Harold he should empty the whole of the countryside behind him, block the roads, burn the villages, destroy the food. His idea being that if he was beaten, William's army would starve in the wasted countryside as winter closed in, and would be forced either to move upon London, where the rest of the English forces and Harold were waiting, or return to their ships. We'll never know Harold's reasoning for not agreeing to this. The other decision he made was to march south right away, rather than take the time to ensure his army and the northern armies were in sync and unified in their march to William. Many of the same housecarl elite troops that had marched 190 miles north with Harold were now again being asked to march, doing an even longer 241-mile forced march to the south, so aggressive that Harold created separation between his and the northern army. Harold arrived with approximately 10,000 men. arrived at a ridge 10 miles northwest of Hastings on the 14th of October. He recognized he had no archers or crossbowmen and had no real choice but to stay put and meet William to decide the future of England's leadership on a narrowing slope atop a hill. Within the last few years, historians and archaeologists have made a compelling argument for the actual site of the battle to be flipped about 90 degrees and a few hundred meters from its current markers. Here, Harold surrounded his standard with the housecarls, armed with their two-handed battle axes and shields, and other professional troops armed with swords and spears. Beyond these were the balance of non-professional men, armed with everything from iron-studded clubs, scythes, reaping hooks, to hay forks. Together, these men stretched some 365 meters westward and 180 meters eastward, a mighty housecarl shield wall running almost the entire length. The slopes beyond this point were steep enough to protect his flanks. Many of the non-professional men on both sides used spears, which were considered the poorer warrior's weapon. They thrusted with them or threw them as javelins. William, with roughly the same amount of men at 10,000, had approximately 1,000 archers at his disposal. Aside from the archers, the main difference between the sides was Harold's almost complete reliance on infantry, while William's ace was his knight on horseback, which carried their long spears. But these knights were not the heavily armored knights of the upcoming 12th and 13th century. These Norman knights wore much lighter armor by comparison. And the easy slope, which was not as steep, would allow William's knights an open approach, against which Harold relied on his shield wall and troops to hurl back. The battle opened at approximately 9 a.m., with William having his archers walk to within 100 meters of the Saxons, upwards on the slope. Most of their first volley was blocked by the housecarl shields. Volley after volley then followed for the next hour to hour and a half, but still the shield wall held. At roughly 10:30, William ordered the archers to pull back, and he pushed forward his Breton infantry from his left flank and Flemish infantry from his right to the same Saxon front flanks to weaken the shield wall there. While the Saxons had no archers at the battle, some of the men hurled slings and heavy stones at the charging Norman infantry, inflicting some damage. After some time, William sent his cavalry in as well, towards the center of the Saxon ranks to face the housecarls. This was where the majority of the housecarls had massed, but they were able to hold their ground, and with their mighty two-handed axes, they inflicted significant damage on the Norman knight cavalry. William had joined the fray, wearing his relics and riding beneath his papal banner. The damage the housecarls were inflicting, and a rumor of William's demise in the midst of all of this chaos, caused the Breton infantry at the left flank to panic and flee, and soon the Flemish, in response to this, also fled. William removed his helmet and was said to have lost a few horses as he rode frantically through his ranks to let the men know he was in fact still alive. The left flank of Bretons that had given way were being pursued down the hill by the Fyrd that they had been attacking. However, the Normans were able to rally and turn on the pursuing Fyrds and encircle them. Now outnumbered and surrounded, the Fyrd were resigned to their fate and charged completely through by the Normans. With this significant group defeated, they had at last a break in the line that Harold had so adamantly warned against. This gave the Normans the opportunity to break into the Saxon position at the top of the slope. William then ordered all of his troops forward. The Normans could now attack from the flanks. Additional Norman arrow volleys complemented their attacks, and amidst this continued onslaught, Harold's brothers were both killed. The few housecarls that were left were forced to form a tight protective circle around the English standard and Harold. The Normans attacked again, and this time they broke through, and Harold and most of his housecarls were killed. With their king dead, the Fyrd saw no reason to stay and fight, and retreated to the woods behind. After 9 hours of ferocious no-quarter fighting, William was victorious. William, the Conqueror as he would be called, ruled until his death in 1087, when his son, would become William II.